What are Indians? Are we descended from Aryans who came in from Europe? Or are we descended from Dravidians who were always here in India? Or are we descended from the Indus Valley civilization? These questions have been very controversial for the last 150 years. But in recent times, we finally have scientific evidence which allows us to answer these questions with a degree of certainty.
Okay, I remember reading in my school textbooks that the Aryans came in via the Khyber Pass, and that's about all I can remember.
So let's start from the beginning of that Aryan theory.
Okay.
In the late 1700s, there was a British linguist who came to India. So he was amazed at how many words in North Indian languages like Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi were similar to words in European languages like Greek, Latin, French, and also Persian. So he came up with the idea that all of these are descendants of a common language called the Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah.
Later, in the mid-1800s, Max Muller came up with the theory that there was a group of people in the Caucasus Mountains who spoke this Proto-Indo-European language, and they spread this all over. Some of them migrated to Europe, giving rise to the European languages. Some went to Persia, giving rise to Persian and Iranian languages. And some came to India, giving rise to Sanskrit and modern Indian languages.
The Caucasus Mountains is where Caucasians are from, the white man, the white Caucasians, right?
Correct. And racist Europeans loved this theory. The theory is that white men spread out and they were the superior race, and they defeated and subjugated the primitive local races, and they ruled the world.
Of course, because why not? The white man's burden, as we all know.
Not just that. Tell me why Caucasus Mountains?
No idea, honestly.
Because that's where Mount Ararat is.
Mount Ararat.
Where Noah's Ark landed after 40 days. So their theory is that the biblical people from Noah's Ark spread out from the Caucasus Mountains, and these Caucasians took over the world and their language took over the world.
So they basically took every possible story that could have been created and mashed it into one single thing that fit into their biblical worldview. Yeah, why not?
This theory, called the Aryan invasion theory, is not taken seriously by anyone in academia anymore, because the evidence is just not there. There is no evidence that Aryans came and invaded. There is no evidence that the local people were primitive and would give up easily, right? The Mohenjo-daro and Harappa civilizations were quite advanced. There is no evidence that these guys came and took over and became rulers.
Okay, so if the Aryan invasion theory is not true, then what is the theory that explains all of this?
Before we go there, let me talk about the reaction of Hindu nationalists to the Aryan invasion theory. They hated the idea so much that they went to the other extreme.
Obviously.
According to them, Hindus have always been here. Because this, the land of Ganga, is our Punya Bhumi and our Pitru Bhumi. So the idea that we came from outside just doesn't gel with their worldview. So their theory is that we are the Aryans. In India, we created Sanskrit, the perfect language. We created Vedas, the perfect books. And then we took it to the rest of the world 7,000 years ago. And that gave rise to Persian and the Western religion. And in Europe, that gave rise to Greek and Latin and all the modern European languages.
And I'm guessing this is not true either.
This is in fact so untrue that no academics take this seriously at all. There is zero evidence for this. There is no archaeological evidence showing movement from here outside. There is no genetic evidence showing movement of genes outside of India. It's less than 2%. And there is no linguistic evidence. All the evidence actually points towards movement into India.
Archaeological evidence as in?
So, for example, you see certain kinds of pottery, say 5,000 years ago in India. Then 4,000 years ago, it shows up in Afghanistan. Then 3,000 years ago, it shows up in Persia. Then 2,000 years ago, it shows up in Ukraine. Then 1000 years ago, it shows up in Europe, right?
So that would mean that pottery went from India to Afghanistan to Persia to Ukraine.
Right, and it's not just pottery, right? It's specific styles. It is a way of making pots. It's a way of making tools. It's a system of using iron, whatever,
Okay.
right? All those things.
Okay, so that evidence points the other way around.
Exactly.
Okay, and the genetic evidence you said?
Correct. So this is the big thing in the last 15-20 years, okay? Because now with DNA sequencing, what we can do is that we can dig up human remains that we find at archaeological websites. We can try to pick out DNA from that and sequence them in the lab.
Okay.
For each such person, we can pick out 600,000 genetic markers.
Okay.
Not just that, but for each one of them, we can use carbon dating so we know the date also.
Okay.
Now imagine that there are two lines of DNA, one in say Iran, and it is showing genetic markers BCDE, 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 and like every few hundred years, and it is going down like this.
Okay.
On this side in India, you are, for similar dates, you are seeing PQRS. In the next generation, there is PQRS. 100 years later, there is PQRS.
Okay.
Suddenly, now you start seeing BCRS, BCRS. Okay.
Oh.
You can clearly see that what has happened is that someone from Persia came to India around this time, and then they started mixing here.
If it were PQDE, then we would say that the mixing happened the other way around.
Correct.
Okay.
Right? And I'm not talking about just 4 or 5 things like that, right? We are talking about 600,000. So
Yeah.
when there is evidence, there is lots of evidence like this.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it.
Now, evidence like this, there are hundreds of papers. Earlier, they used to be the archaeological evidence, okay? But now, at least dozens of papers with genetic evidence showing flow towards India, related to India.
Have been published. Okay.
We will focus primarily on one paper, which is like an awesome paper.
Okay.
2019 paper. It has 100 plus co-authors from 18 countries, including from Indian colleges.
Okay.
This paper analyzed DNA from 800 different persons from 19 different locations all over this region.
Huh.
Dates from 12,000 BC all the way to 1 BC.
Okay.
Okay. And 269 distinct dates
Okay,
by
so-
carbon dating.
So 269 different points in time over a period of 12,000 years. Remember that everything we do here is backed by scientific research and scientific data. So even when we are giving examples, those examples are actually from existing papers and existing research. So in this particular case, this paper has data from a period of 12,000 years. There are 269 different points in those 12,000 years that are being considered, but those are enough to establish a clear timeline.
Not just that, but the findings of this paper agree with all the other evidence, the archaeological evidence, the linguistic evidence, the anthropological evidence, and evidence from stories of all the different cultures.
Okay, so this looks like a fairly solid bit of research here.
Absolutely. What does this paper say? It says that modern Indian DNA has come from 3 sources of DNA.
Okay.
The first is ancient hunter-gatherers who came out of Africa to India around 65,000 years ago. The second wave is of Middle Eastern pre-farmers who came around 6,000 to 4,000 BC. The third wave was steppe herders. These are from the steppe grasslands, Ukraine, Kazakhstan. They came in around 1800 BC.
Okay. Okay.
So now let's look at these 3 waves in detail and what they did to India.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
So first, 65,000 years ago, humans from Africa, they crossed the Red Sea, they crossed Arabia, they crossed Persia, Afghanistan, and then came into India, settled all these places.
Correct.
They continued. They went to the Andamans, they went to Indonesia, they went to Australia, and some of that still exists. You can see that DNA in some Andaman tribes, some of the Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and so on. Okay.
Okay.
So now India is sparsely populated by these hunter-gatherers.
Okay.
Okay. This situation continues for like 60,000 years.
Okay.
All right. Now, around 9,000, 8,000, 7,000 BC, in the region which is now Iran,
Okay.
the Fertile Crescent, some of the people started to kind of figure out a little bit of cultivation of crops.
Okay.
They were not full-fledged farmers. They just understood some seeds, wheat and barley, and wherever they went, they would try to grow it, sometimes with success, sometimes with failure.
Fair enough.
These people, some of them, started coming towards India. Okay. And when they reached the Indus Valley, they settled there.
Okay.
Okay. Now the thing is that for a pre-farming society like this, life isn't easy when you move. The reason is that they didn't understand farming technology as such. They didn't understand different kinds of seeds.
Okay.
What happened was that where they came from, the Fertile Crescent, there rain happened in winter. So they had wheat and barley seeds which would grow very well if you had winter rain. But they moved to Indus Valley where there is rain in monsoon, summer.
Correct.
So their seeds didn't grow as well and they were struggling a little bit.
Makes sense.
So what ended up happening is that they ended up with decent relations with the hunter-gatherers and there was trade.
Correct.
When their crops worked well, they would give it to the hunter-gatherers. When not, they would take stuff from hunter-gatherers and things happened.
Correct. Okay.
After a while, they slowly figured out variants of those seeds which worked well in this monsoon climate.
Agriculture developed.
Agriculture developed, cities started developing, they had surplus of food, they could use that for all kinds of things, and over time they developed irrigation. That's how we got the Indus Valley civilization. Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, everything else.
Oh, are these the Aryans that we spoke about at the beginning?
No.
Okay.
But let's first understand the current situation.
Okay.
Inside India, there are the ancient hunter-gatherers.
Right.
In the northwest, Indus Valley, there is this new thing called the Indus Valley civilization, which consists of a mixture of Middle Eastern pre-farmer DNA and ancient hunter-gatherer DNA. Remember, there was trading and intermixing for many centuries here.
Correct.
That's the current situation.
Yeah.
Okay? Aryans haven't arrived yet. But before the Aryans arrive, something important happens.
Okay. What?
This Indus Valley civilization reached its peak around 2500 BC.
Okay.
It flourished for the next 600 years. And then suddenly, starting around 1900, it began to decline.
Why?
We don't know for sure. Okay? We know that it wasn't a war, it wasn't some sudden natural disaster. Okay? We believe it was because rivers dried up. Okay?
Okay.
Because of various geological action, there was the Ghaggar-Hakra river system here,
Okay.
which just changed course, and this whole civilization, which depended on the rivers and irrigation of the rivers, couldn't survive anymore, and they started dying out. Some of them, of course, started migrating into India.
Okay. Is this or could this be the famed Saraswati river that disappeared during that time?
We are not sure, but it could be. Okay? Because around that time, there was a river system and there is evidence that it disappeared. There are some mismatches there, but it could be. Okay? It could be Saraswati.
The mystery continues.
Yeah. But now what's happening is that these Indus Valley people are moving into India.
Okay.
Okay. Remember that whenever they move to a new location, they struggle initially because their crops and their systems are not adapted for that.
Correct.
And because of that, again, they are trading and intermixing with the locals.
Yeah.
At that time, again, the locals now are still the ancient hunter-gatherers who are mixing with the Indus Valley people now.
Okay. The Indus Valley people being a mix of the Middle Eastern farmers and the ancient hunter-gatherers from earlier.
Correct. After a while, what begins to happen is that their agriculture technology starts working. Okay? And they slowly become more and more prosperous.
Correct.
This results in two things. One is that the population explodes.
Okay.
We have done an episode on why India is the most populous country. It is related exactly to this.
Yeah.
Second thing is that some of them start migrating south.
Okay.
Okay. And the same thing repeats. Whenever they migrate a little bit, there is initial period of struggle, there is some intermixing, then they migrate further. So, a gradation gets set up in India from north to south.
Gradation in terms of the DNA percentages
Correct.
mixed.
Yeah. So in the north, it is much more Indus Valley DNA and very little ancient hunter-gatherers.
Okay.
In the south, there is more ancient hunter-gatherer and less Indus Valley.
Correct. Correct.
If you look in terms of the original Middle Eastern pre-farmer, okay, so in the north, about 50 to 70% is that DNA.
Okay.
And in the south, about 30 to 40% is that DNA.
Okay. Okay.
This we are going to call ANI and ASI.
Okay.
Ancestral North Indian and Ancestral South Indian.
Okay.
So these are sort of the ancestors of North and South India. This is the situation in India from around 1800 BCE to 1000 BC, right?
Okay, so this is the period of the Indus Valley civilization declining.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Around 1600 BC, steppe herders from Central Asia, Eastern Europe, they started moving south.
Okay.
Near Tajikistan, they split. One part went to Iran and became ancient Persians.
Okay.
The other part came to India, and these were the Aryans.
Oh.
But we are not going to use the word Aryans because racist people took that word and they have completely changed the meaning of the word Aryan.
Yeah.
So we'll refer to them as steppe herders.
All right.
Okay.
Fair.
But these are the guys who came in with a language which was one of the ancestors of Sanskrit.
Okay.
And they came in with a religion which was one of the ancestors of the Vedic religion. Okay.
Okay.
But what the DNA evidence shows is that these guys came and they settled and they intermixed with the local populations, which is the ANI and ASI.
Okay.
But in a very interesting manner. The DNA evidence shows that only the male DNA from steppe herders is there in India today. Almost all the female DNA is from the ancestral hunter-gatherers, not even from the Middle Eastern pre-farmers.
That's very interesting.
So first of all, how do we know this?
Yeah.
Our DNA actually is two different sets of DNA. One is the regular DNA that you all know about.
Okay.
And that half you get from your mother, half you get from your father.
Right.
But in the mitochondria, there is mitochondrial DNA and 100% of it has come from your mother and she has gotten it from her mother and she has gotten it from her mother. So you can trace an unbroken line back through all the mothers.
So mitochondria is not just the power of the cell, it is also a record of all your ancestral DNA of sorts.
Of female ancestral DNA, right?
Fair. Okay.
So, what we know is that the steppe herders probably came here without women and they started intermixing with local women. Not just that, but looks like at least some places they outcompeted the local men. Okay? So their percentages increased.
Okay.
And just like the Indus Valley people, some of them slowly moved south, but not a whole lot. So again, there is a gradation.
Right.
In North India, maximum 30% DNA is steppe herder male DNA. In South India, it is as low as 10%. There are a few tribals who have 0% steppe DNA.
Okay. So at this point, North India is mostly Middle Eastern pre-farmer DNA with probably an equal amount of steppe farmer and ancient hunter-gatherer DNA mixed in.
So 40, 30, 30 is the breakup percentage.
Okay. There you go. And South India is more of the Middle Eastern pre-farmer DNA because at this point through the Indus Valley civilization and etc. they've come in. So it's mostly Middle Eastern pre-farmer DNA with another large part of ancient hunter-gatherer DNA, but only a small part of the steppe herder DNA mixing in.
Yeah, so actually it's 10% steppe herder, 40% Middle Eastern pre-farmer and 50% ancestral hunter-gatherers.
Okay, ancestral, not ancient, sorry. But then these are the Dravidians that we speak about, just checking.
Yes.
Okay.
By the way, another thing to keep in mind is that the amount of DNA varies quite a lot by caste.
Okay.
Okay. In North India, if you look at the amount of step herder DNA, different castes have different amounts, and the maximum is in the Brahmins and the Bhumihars, the castes which were traditionally in charge of Sanskrit and of the rituals of puja and all of that. Okay, and it reduces as you go over to the other castes.
It kind of makes sense when you realize that a lot of your initial rituals might have forbidden going out of your tribe, and from the tribe castes were born, kind of. But it's very interesting to note that your DNA percentages are regulated by caste.
Well, that's a tricky question, okay?
Okay.
Because two things. One is that up till about 100 AD, okay? So from 1300 BCE for the next 1500 years, there was lots of intermixing going on, okay? The DNA evidence, they have looked at the ancient DNA and they have also looked at DNA of 70 different groups of modern Indians, and they have done an analysis. And what they found is that there was lots of intermixing across all castes and jatis and whatever happening until about 100 AD. And then it just kind of stopped. And since 100 AD until modern India, there is very little intermixing across castes. So DNA from 100 AD of a particular caste will be very similar to that same caste today, because suddenly you became endogamous, that is marrying within your caste.
Yeah.
So another interesting finding related to our castes from DNA.
Wow, so from 100 AD till about 2000 AD, for about 1900 years, we were endogamous, we were only marrying within the caste, and only in recent times this entire inter-caste marriage has sort of again allowed us to mix DNAs. Very interesting. We started about 65,000 years ago and we've just reached 2000 AD and probably 2024
Right. So I
AD.
think to summarize, right, Indians are a mix of ancient hunter-gatherers from 65,000 years ago from Africa, Middle Eastern farmers who came 6,000 to 4,000 BC, and step herders who came around 1800 BC, right? All Indians are a mix of all three. Okay? There is nobody who's only step herder or only Aryan or whatever. All the languages are also a mix. What the step herders brought in, mixed with what the North Indians were doing, mixed with what the South Indians were doing. Very likely that the ancient hunter-gatherers in South India had an old language, probably Proto-Dravidian, and the Indus Valley languages mixed with that to form Dravidian languages. And then the step herders came in with the pre-Sanskrit, and that mixed with all of this to form Sanskrit, and then those formed all the modern Indian languages, right?
Wow. Okay, now suddenly the history of ancient India and India in modern times ties in very beautifully together. But my first question still remains, how do we now know for sure that this is a migration and not an invasion? What part of this entire theory or this entire research disproves the invasion part?
We don't see evidence that should have been there if it was an invasion. Okay. There are no large numbers of massacred victims as would happen at the end of a war. There is no large-scale destruction of property. What we see is more consistent with a gradual decline over centuries. Okay. No sudden DNA changes. When a foreign power comes in and takes over, there is a sudden change in DNA. But here everything was very gradual.
Correct. And because generally back in those days, any foreign power coming in trying to invade would basically be committing genocide. There would be large scale deaths and massacres and entire DNA lineages wiped out.
Correct. Another thing is no sudden changes in material culture, like the pottery and the implements and the tools. Those also changed very gradually.
Correct.
And no sudden change in languages, right? You know, otherwise when Mughals came in, suddenly you're switching over to Persian, right? But instead, here there was just a very gradual change in languages. So all of this points to it being a gradual change. And second is, if you look at the DNA evidence, the so-called Aryans, the steppe herders, ultimately were only like a small percent of the DNA.
Correct.
Right? So two things to keep in mind.
Right. So that explains why it's not an invasion. This entire episode just explained why it is not out of India. And the Aryan migration into India rather than invasion of India makes more sense. A completely new outlook into the whole theory that we've been learning half and half since school. And lots to think about, lots to take home. Drop your thoughts in the comments for sure, which I'm guessing you must be itching to do by now. Shrikant, Naveen, Future IQ.